Hello, everyone. I'm Nguyen Liu from Washington University in St. Louis. So in this part of the lecture, I will focus on pre-solar silicon carbide stardust, which is the best studied pre-solar phase. We will have a look at their different stellar origins and see what we can learn about stellar nucleosynthesis by studying the isotopic compositions of pre-solar silicon carbide grains. Before the discovery of pre-solar grains, our only approach to study stardust grains is by spectroscopic observations as shown here. And this is how stellar dust grains look like through telescopes. Shown here are the ALMA observations of supernova 1987A. And we can see clear dust formations in the center of the supernova remnants at shoulder wavelengths. However, most dust phases have very weak spectral features, making it very challenging to study dust chemistry by spectroscopic observations. Where the telescope ends and the microscope begins. To our cosmochemists, this is how stellar dust grains look like under microscopes, and has given you a very good introduction of pre-solar grains in the first part of this lecture. Now you should have known that stardust grains have very different morphologies and compositions as shown here, representing their very diverse condensation environments in their parent stars. As we can see, pre-solar grains are generally small. They're only micron to submicron in size or even nanometer in size. Our modern analytical techniques give us the capability to study their chemical, isotopic, and also structural compositions down to atomic scale. And silicon carbide here will be the focus of this lecture here. Just to briefly remind you, pre-solar grains can be identified in extraterrestrial materials from solar grains based on their isotopic compositions. And this is because different types of stars produce different nuclei by different nucleosynthetic processes. And we know the isotopic composition of our solar system. We chose carbon and nitrogen and oxygen here, for example, because these three elements are the most abundant elements in our solar system, except for hydrogen and helium. And these are the range of isotopic ratios we see across our solar system. Now we zoom out of our solar system and look for dust grains from actual solar systems. And in these two plots, the solar system appears as this red box. Now we see compared to the solar system, the two red boxes in these two plots, pre-solar grains are things that look quite exotic in their isotopic compositions. They show variations in these isotopic ratios by orders of magnitude. And these large variations cannot be explained by any solar system processes. And we see here that we have both carbon-rich and also oxygen-rich pre-solar grains formed in different types of stars in different chemical environments. Anne has mentioned in her lecture that we can find pre-solar grains in primitive extraterrestrial materials, but also as she has already mentioned, even in the most primitive materials, pre-solar grains are extremely rare. For example, the abundance of pre-solar silicon carbide grains is only 30 ppm in primitive meteorites. And this means that we have to measure 1 million grains before finding only 30 pre-solar silicon carbide grains. So finding pre-solar grains in meteorites is pretty much like finding a needle in a haystack. Luckily, we can burn down the haystack to find the needle. This is because most of the pre-solar mineral phases are resistant to acids, including silicon carbide. And when we put a piece of meteorite in a mixture of strong acids, most materials can be dissolved away. Then the acid residue consists of concentrated pre-solar mineral phases, and this greatly reduces the time and the cost of bonding pre-solar grains. And this technique shown here is described as burning down the haystack to find the needle. And the silicon carbide grains we will be examining here in the rest of the lecture were all extracted from primitive meteorites using this method. So here's an overview of the topics I'm going to cover in this part of the lecture. We will first have a look at the two different types of mass spectrometers we use for analyzing the isotopic compositions of single micron to submicron sized pre-solar silicon carbide grains. And after that, we will be looking at the isotopic data collected using these mass spectrometers for different types of pre-solar silicon carbide grains. And based on these isotopic data, we will see how we can interpret these isotopic data based on stellar models and nuclear physics. I mean, the nuclear cross sections we measured in the laboratory. So we use two different types of mass spectrometers to do isotopic analysis of single pre-solar silicon carbide grains for different elements. This includes secondary ion mass spectrometers and the resonance ionization mass spectrometers. Anne has already given you a very detailed explanation of how SIMS instruments work. So here I will compare RIMS with SIMS to show you their differences and why we need them for analyzing isotopes of different elements. So first of all, the two types of instrument both direct either an ion source or a laser beam onto the surface of a grain to release some material from the surface, as we see here. So in the released material, as we see here, so it consists mainly of neutrons, the black circles, with a very small fraction of ions shown here as these red circles. And these red circles, the ions, we call them secondary ions. So in the instrument like NanoSIMS, the secondary ions, the red particles in the cloud are directly extracted into the mass spectrometer by applying an electrical field, and the isotopes of an element then get separated by a magnet and counted by different detectors in the SIMS instrument. So as Anne has already mentioned, so for SIMS instruments, well, we see that the secondary ions are only a very small fraction of the released material. So we really need to have a high transmission in the mass spectrometer in order to make sure that most of the secondary ions in this released material get detected at the end, so that we have enough counts to do isotope analysis. Also, since in this released material from the surface, it contains everything and it's not exclusive. I mean, this ionization process is not exclusive. So we need to have a high mass resolution in the SIMS instruments to get rid of aspheric interferences. So take nitrogen isotope analysis, for example. So nitrogen is measured in NanoSIMS as say molecules for silicon carbide grains, and these two species shown here have essentially the same mass at mass 27, and therefore they arrive at the same detector of a NanoSIMS instrument. So if we didn't have such high mass resolving power, then some of the carbon-13 nitrogen-14 molecules would be counted as carbon-12 nitrogen-15, and this would increase the total nitrogen-15 counts and resulting in lowered nitrogen-14 to 15 ratio measured for a grain. Therefore, high transmission and high mass resolution are the keys of SIMS instruments. In comparison to SIMS, RIMS uses the majority of neutrons in the released material. So these black circles. And in order to ionize these neutrons for them to fly in the mass spectrometer, so RIMS instruments need to post-ionize these neutrons using laser beams with the laser wavelengths tuned to match the atomic structure of an element of interest. For example, if we want to measure strontium isotopes, we need to have two post-ionization lasers with their wavelengths tuned to these numbers in order to only ionize strontium atoms in the cloud with high efficiency. And this process is called resonance ionization. Then only strontium atoms in this cloud get ionized, and then they can fly in the mass spectrometer and get detected. Therefore, in RIMS instruments, we don't need to worry about atmospheric interferences as the post-ionization process is selective, and we only detect what we want at the end. Also, because RIMS instruments target such the large fraction of neutrons released from the surface, RIMS instruments have high efficiencies and allow to detect isotopes of elements like strontium in pre-solar grains in trace amounts. And here it shows you this post-ionization process, and we use post-ionization lasers to resonantly ionize strontium isotopes in this cloud, and then the ionized secondary ions fly in the mass spectrometer and then get detected. And here is a summary of the two types of mass spectrometers and a comparison of their differences in detail. So we don't have time to go through all these technical details, but feel free to ask questions during our group discussion session. As a result, SIMS instruments are suitable to measure elements of abundant isotopes of abundant elements in a light mass region without significant atmospheric interferences, while in contrast, the RIMS instruments are better at measuring isotopes of trace elements in the heavy mass region, where you expect significant atmospheric interferences because RIMS instruments have a higher sensitivity and selectivity. So the takeaway here is that the combination of these two types of mass spectrometers give us the possibility of measuring isotopes of almost all the elements in the periodic table in pre-solar grains. And based on these isotopic data, we can then explore the entire stellar nucleosynthesis path in different types of stars. So highlighted here is a list of elements that we will be looking at in the rest part of this lecture. And this includes both light elements and also heavy elements, isotopes measured by both SIMS and RIMS instruments. And now we move to the science part of this lecture, and we'll first discuss silicon carbide grains from low mass asymptotic giant branch stars. And Amanda provided a detailed lecture on silicon carbide grains on AJB stars and the associated stellar nucleosynthesis. So in the following slides, we will be examine our current knowledge of AJB stellar nucleosynthesis using real AJB Stardust grain data. So pre-solar silicon carbide grains have been divided into different groups based on their carbon, nitrogen, and also silicon isotopic ratios. And based on extensive isotopic studies of a variety of elements, previous studies have shown that mainstream Y and Z grains all likely came from AJB stars. And altogether, these three types of silicon carbide grains make make up more than 90% of pre-solar silicon carbide grains identified in primitive extraterrestrial materials. So AGB stellar dust grains dominate the silicon carbide stardust inventory in the solar system. And just to briefly remind you, AGB is a period of stellar evolution undertaken by all low to intermediate mass stars late in their lives. And AGB stars experience alternate hydrogen and helium burning, resulting in this layered structure, including a CO core, a helium burning shell, a hydrogen burning shell, and a convective hydrogen envelope. And the current stellar models predict that the stars with masses between about 1.5 to 3 solar masses can all become carbon-rich in the hydrogen envelope during their AGB phase. And shown on the right here is the density distribution of pre-solar silicon carbide grains compiled in the pre-solar grain database, and shown here is still is the carbon versus is the nitrogen versus carbon isotope ratios. And for reference, the pre-solar grain database contains the isotopic data for more than 10,000 pre-solar silicon carbide grains that were collected in the past 30 years. Since it is believed that these grains here, mainstream Y and Z grains, came from low-mass AGB stars, we can compare the grains measured carbon and nitrogen isotopic compositions to spectroscopic observations of N-type carbon stars, because N-type carbon stars are the classical low-mass AGB stars, and these blue stars shown here were reported by Hadrasa et al. 2013. And immediately, we see that compared to the stellar observations, the high density grain region shows lower nitrogen 14 to 15 ratios, and there's a discrepancy between the grain data and these stellar observations. So does this discrepancy indicate that mainstream Y and Z grains did not come from low mass AGB stars? Or could the low nitrogen 14 to 15 ratios measured in the grains result from sampling solar terrestrial materials during our isotopic analysis, so their measured nitrogen 14 to 15 ratios were lowered compared to the true stellar composition? So indeed, as Anne mentioned, these pre-solar silicon carbide grains were buried in their host meteorite for billions of years. Also, we have to do extensive laboratory work to extract these grains by acid dissolution, during which terrestrial contamination could have been introduced. And here is a clear example of an organic coated pre-solar silicon carbide grain. And if we were to measure its nitrogen isotopic composition, the sampled material would be a mixture of stellar and solar materials, and therefore the determined carbon and nitrogen isotopic composition of this grain would lie somewhere between the true stellar and then the solar compositions, and therefore the measured ratio would not reflect the true stellar composition of this grain's parent star. In other words, the measured isotopic data would be compromised by sampling carbon and nitrogen signals from the organic gunk on the surface. And in principle, we can circumvent the problem of surface contamination by doing extensive sputtering in the NanoSIMS instrument using the cesium beam, which can remove the surface material, the surface organic gunk, I mean, and expose the interior clean surfaces for our carbon and nitrogen isotopic analysis. So recently I did such tests, and we will see in the next slide what we get by purposely removing the surface material. So here on the left is what we saw earlier from the literature data with the carbon star observations. And in comparison, we have the new data plotted on the right as yellow circles. And for direct comparison, the distribution of the new green data is also shown as a grayscale density map for comparison with the literature data on the left. And based on such a direct comparison, we indeed see that the new grains show significantly increased natural 14 to 15 ratios. Now we can add the carbon star observations in the plot on the right, and we see the observations mostly falling to the high density grain region, and this points to a very good agreement. So the takeaway here is that the consistent carbon and nitrogen isotopic compositions between mainstream YZ grains and the stellar observations for N-type carbon stars provide solid evidence that these grains came from classical low-mass AJB stars. And this is further corroborated by their similar populations, because these three types of silicon carbide grains dominate in the pre-solar silicon carbide population, while N-type carbon stars are the most abundant type of carbon stars. So we expect most silicon carbide grains came from N-type carbon stars, and this is what we observed. And finally, it is noteworthy that asteroidal and terrestrial contamination is always a big problem for isotopic analysis of pre-solar grains, given their small sizes. They're only sub-micron to micron in size. And when we see discrepancies between grain data and observations and also model calculations, we always need to consider the possibility of contamination. Also, if we know contamination is indeed a problem, so we can further refine our analytic methods to mitigate the problem. Now we know that mainstream grains came from low-mass asymptotic giant branch stars. Starting from this slide, we will be looking at the slow neutron capture process in AJB stars and see how we can use the isotopic composition of mainstream grains to constrain the S process. We know that AJB stars are the main stellar set for the S process, and because this was confirmed by the detection of tactitium in AJB stars by Paul Mary more than half a century ago. The detection of tactitium was very peculiar because tactitium has no stable isotopes, and one of its isotopes, tactitium-99, has a half-life time of 0.2 milliyears. And the nuclide chart in this region clearly shows us that tactitium-99 can only be made if molybdenum-99 undergoes beta minus decay before capturing a neutron. And this corresponds to a low neutron density capture environment, and therefore the S process. So the presence of tactitium in stars envelopes clearly points out that there's in situ production of tactitium by the S process in AJB stars interior. So the S process is very important because it is responsible for making half of the heavy elements in the solar system. And in the solar system, elemental distribution is characterized by 3 S process peaks as highlighted here. Without the S process, a large fraction of the rare earth elements would disappear from the universe, and today we would probably not be able to talk to each other virtually today. And next, we will zoom into this region and focus on the S process nuclides by multiplying their y-axis values here by their corresponding neutron capture cross-section values. Then we transform the previous plot to this plot given in a review paper of Kepler et al. 2011. These squares along the path are the S process nuclides in the solar system, which means that they were mainly made by the S process in ancient AGB stars prior to the solar system formation. And this plot contains all the information about the S process. So we see the neutron flow starts from the iron peak and slowly decreases toward the heavier nuclides because there are many neutron sinks along the path. We also see that this distribution has 3 distinct steps, and within each 2 steps, it remains quite constant. This is because the S process is a slow neutron capture process, so it reaches equilibrium along its path. However, because the neutron capture cross sections of strontium-88, barium-138, and lead-208 are an order of magnitude smaller than the cross sections of their adjacent nuclides, so equilibrium cannot be established at these 3 different points, and as a result, neutrons are accumulated at these 3 bottlenecks, resulting in decreased amounts of neutrons flowing into the next region. Also, these 3 bottlenecks correspond to the 3 S process peaks here we saw in this slide. So far, we have seen that the S process theory is very solid and sound. However, modeling the S process in AGB stars has been quite a scientific challenge. We know the major neutron source for the S process should be the carbon-13 alpha N reaction because its reaction rate at relevant AGB temperatures provides neutrons with the low densities required by the S process. We also know the S process mainly occurs in the helium intershell of an AGB star. Once the S process products are made, they can be brought up to the surface by a phenomenon called third dredge-ups later. And this is why we can observe a tactitium on the surface of AGB stars. We see that the helium intershell is full of carbon-12 by the triple as a product of triple alpha reaction. And also this helium intershell is surrounded by a giant hydrogen envelope. So if the hydrogen in the convective envelope can be mixed inward, then carbon-12 can capture protons to form carbon-13, the major neutron source for the S process. However, here is the problem for stellar modelers. Stellar modelers can't well handle such local dynamic instabilities along this boundary. And to make the problem worse here, a variety of instabilities caused by different physical mechanisms can occur along this boundary, and we don't know if they work together or independently on forming and shaping the carbon-13 in the helium intershell in AGB stars. And these uncertainties resulted in very different results for the carbon-13 formation. And plotted here is the carbon-13 concentration in the helium intershell below the hydrogen envelope. We see that even by considering the same mechanisms, it can result in quite different results due to involved free parameters. So the properties of the formed carbon-13 need to be further constrained by experimental work. Since we have mainstream silicon carbide grains from AGB stars, we can analyze the isotopic compositions of S process elements to constrain the carbon-13 formation. And this part of the helium intershell that contains carbon-13 is often called the carbon-13 pocket. So for the experimental work, of course, we want to choose the most sensitive nuclides for our measurements as the smoking guns for constraining carbon-13 formation. And coming back to this plot, it shows that the abundances of most S-process nuclides are simply reversely correlated with their neutron capture cross sections, because the y-axis is almost constant within each region. So no matter what the hydrogen mixing profile is, their abundances barely vary. On the other hand, as I pointed out earlier, we see that the 3 steps here, because equilibrium is not established at these 3 points because of their extremely small neutron capture cross sections. So for instance, if the S process starts with a higher neutron density flow, a higher fraction of neutrons would be trapped at the first bottleneck at strontium-88, resulting in an enhanced strontium-88 abundance. Therefore, so the abundance of strontium-88, barium-138, and Li-208 should be most sensitive to the details of the carbon-13 formation. Therefore, in the following slides, we will use the strontium and barium isotopic compositions of mainstream grains to constrain the carbon-13 pocket for the S process. Although it would also be ideal to measure lead isotopes, lead is a volatile element, which means their concentrations in pre-solar silicon carbide grains are extremely low, and their low abundances make such measurements very challenging. So the data shown here are delta values, and delta values are defined as the ratio measured in the grain, the division of the ratio measured in the grain from the solar system value, and then magnified by a factor of 1,000. So in the solar system value composition here is at 0. Although there exist some scatters among the grains, we see most of the grains lie within this purple box and show lower than solar values with very small scatters. And in addition to the strontium and barium isotopic data, we're also going to use the nickel isotopes of nickel isotopic data of mainstream grains measured by Trapich et al., also using a RIMS instrument. So nickel is also very important because it sits next to the iron seeds for the S process, and it tells us what fraction of the neutrons get trapped here. Then nickel, strontium, and barium isotope ratios together act as 3 monitors along the S process path. And by knowing their abundances in mainstream grains, we can closely trace the neutron flow for the S process in their parent stars. So in the following slides, we're going to compare the mainstream grain data with AGB model calculations. These calculations were done by using a post-process approach. In detail, the AGB stellar models only include a minimum set of nuclides whose fusion reactions provide energies for a star to evolve. However, since we're interested in knowing the simulation results for much heavier elements, we can extract the obtained stellar parameters and simulate the carbon-13 profiles and then run nucleosynthesis codes for the whole network in a post-process way. The validity of such an approach for the S process was demonstrated by Gleno et al. More than 20 years ago. And it is widely used in the nucleosynthesis community, especially for more massive stars. This post-process approach greatly reduces the computational cost, and one can afford to quickly test the modeling results in a large parameter space. So shown here are the comparison plots of the grain data with post-AGB models for a 3 solar mass 1.5 solar metallicity star provided by my collaborators Roberto Gleno and Sergio Cristallo. So the model predictions for the stellar envelope are shown as lines with the symbols, and the symbols represent the carbon-rich phase. And because silicon carbide can only condense in carbon-rich gas, the grain data should only be compared to the symbols. The envelope starts with the solar composition and becomes more and more enriched in as-processed products because more and more as-processed products are dredged up to the surface during the stellar evolution. We can see the carbon-13 pocket adopted here has an exponential profile, mixing profile with a mixing depth of 1 × 10⁻³ solar mass and a standard mass fraction. So this standard carbon-13 mass fraction was named the standard case because the solar system as process abundances were produced by using such a case by Arlandini et al. 1999. However, we see that the model predictions match poorly with the grain data, which means that we need to play with different carbon-13 formation parameters in order to improve the data model agreements. Once we increase the mixing depth by a factor of 4, we can see that the match in the strontium barium plot is significantly improved. However, the predictions in the nickel-3 isotope plots greatly increased and shifted to the right, resulting in an even worse match with the grain data. So the pocket size here doesn't work. We can also try to reduce the carbon-13 mass fraction by a factor of 3. Although this improves the match in the nickel-3 isotope plots, it results in an even worse match in the strontium barium isotope plot. So neither the mixing depth nor the carbon-13 mass fraction can help to explain the data model discrepancy. There's still one parameter that we still haven't changed yet, the mixing profile. So in the previous slide, we adopted the exponential mixing profile as used in the literature for the last 20 years. However, a recent investigation of the effect of magnetic buoyancy suggests that carbon-13 should have a more flattened carbon-13 profile and distributed deeper into the helium intershell. So we implanted this profile in our model calculations. Immediately, we see this magnetic buoyancy induced a carbon-13 pocket resulting in much improved data model agreement. And by varying the mixing depth by a factor of 3, we see the model predictions barely vary. And this is consistent with the distribution of the grain data because most of the grain data lie within this purple box with very small scatters. So on the basis of this work, my collaborators Diego Vascov and Sergio Cristallo further tested this conclusion by running fully coupled stellar models. And in the new simulations, it includes the full nucleosynthesis network. And these fully coupled models also self-consistently take account of the effect of magnetic buoyancy, such that hydrogen gets mixed into the helium intershell to form carbon-13 automatically during the stellar evolution. So here are the new results. The upper panel shows the models with overshoot these 4 sets of models. Now overshoot induced a carbon-13 formation. And these exponential carbon-13 mixing profiles cannot consistently explain the grains strontium, barium, and nickel isotopic compositions. And we see most of these models predict too high strontium 88 abundances, meaning higher than needed amounts of neutrons are trapped at this first bottleneck. So in contrast, once the effect of magnetic buoyancy is included, we see the resultant carbon-13 formation leads to a consistent explanation of the grain data as shown by the red circles here. Also, by running the same simulations for two solar mass stars with different velocities, the bottom panel shows that the spread of the grain data is also well explained. Therefore, these self-consistent full nucleosynthesis calculations confirmed our previous conclusion based on the post-process calculations. And all these studies together consistently point to the crucial role of magnetic fields in forming and shaping the neutron source carbon-13 for the S process. After learning about the stellar origin of mainstream Y and Z grains and our insights into the S process in low mass AGB stars based on these grain data, in the rest of the slides, we're going to move to type 2 supernova events and learn about their silicon carbide dust grains. So type X grains lying in this region of the nitrogen versus carbon isotope plot are believed to have come from type 2 core collapse supernovae. Just as you know, X grains are extremely rare. Only 1 in 100 pre-solar silicon carbide grains belongs to this group, while the mainstream grains dominant in the silicon carbide population, and they're more than 85% of the whole pre-solar silicon carbide inventory. So I'm sure all of you would agree with me that supernovae are simply amazing celestial events. The type that we're going to be looking at in the following slides is type 2 core collapse supernova. And shown here is a pre-supernova massive star at its blue supergiant phase, which is a bit hotter and has a faster wind compared to its previous phase, red supergiant. So the faster wind caught up with the previous slow wind and made a rain of dense material. So the star continues to evolve and then explodes. And in the center, that pristine material cools off from millions of degrees inside the star, and a lot of gas is now condensing into dust grains. Type 2 supernova is a prolific dust producer in the universe, and some of its dust grains carry distinctive isotopic signatures, such as aluminum-26 and titanium-44. The pre-supernova star has this unusual structure as a result of fusion reactions. Fusion reactions occur in the star to counter the gravity and prevent the star from collapsing. And because of increasing stellar temperature, the star fuses heavier elements toward its center. It starts with hydrogen and then helium and processes up through the periodic table until a core of iron and nickel is produced. So fusion reaction stops here because iron and nickel have the highest bonding energies. At this point, no energy can be released. So the star collapses onto itself, and the sudden compression of the inner core leads to an expanding shock wave moving outward. In other words, a type 2 supernova explosion occurs. So we will be talking about the radioactive titanium-44 in the next few slides. And just for reference, titanium-44 is formed deep inside the supernova during the explosion. So titanium-44 is a radioactive isotope with a half-life time of about 60 years. It first decays to scandium-44 and then calcium-44. And the gamma ray emissions during the decay have been detected in supernova 1987A and also Cas-A. And both of these two supernovae are type 2 supernovae. Since X grains are more than 4.6 billion years old, even if they incorporated the titanium-44, titanium-44 would have all become calcium-44 because the half-life time of titanium-44 is only 60 years. So we need to measure the calcium isotope ratios in the grain to infer the initial presence of titanium-44. And we did observe large titanium-44 excesses in X grains. And then the values are shown in delta notation, which is defined again as a division of the isotope ratio from the solar system value and then magnified by a factor of 1,000. So 0 again represents the solar system value. And in comparison, supernova models predict larger excesses in calcium-43 than in calcium-44. So the calcium-44 excesses observed here can only be explained by the decay of titanium-44. And titanium-44, in other words, is the smoking gun that links X grains to type 2 supernovae. And in the following slides, I'm going to show you an example of using the isotopic data for X grains to constrain the dust formation timing after the supernova explosion. So shown here are the silicon isotopic compositions of X grains. Again, the solar system value is 0. And most X grains have negative delta values, meaning excesses in the denominator isotope silicon-28 compared to the solar system composition. And in a type 2 supernova, the silicon-sulfur zone is the only place that contains pure silicon-28. So X grains must have sampled material from this inner silicon-sulfur zone. So you may be questioning this simplified onion shell structure because in reality, after the explosion, the observed supernova remnant looks much more complicated. And such a symmetric structure, in fact, can be simulated by current state-of-the-art 3D magnetohydrodynamic supernova models. But the problem here is that we're talking about micron-sized dust grains, while the spatial resolution of both observations and simulations are on the order on the scale of astronomical units. Therefore, comparing micron-sized dust grains with simulated ejective tens of orders of magnitude larger is pretty much like comparing oranges with apples. Instead, we can reduce the complexity of the problem here by using simplified 1D supernova model calculations as shown in the previous slides. The simulated supernova materials shown in the following models were processed by the shock wave. It's just that the 1D simulations did not consider instabilities caused by the outward expanding shock wave. As a result, the supernova ejecta maintained the onion shell structure as its pre-supernova phase. As we will see, the unique isotopic signatures of X grains actually allow us to trace the origin of their materials. So in fact, we can figure out this mixing process and do not need to rely on complex 3D model calculations. As we just learned, X grains must have sampled material from this inner silicon-sulfur zone. And this zone also contains vanadium-49, which is radioactive and decays to titanium-49 with a half-life time of about 1 year. So it is possible that X grains sampled live vanadium-49 during its formation. Now we know that the large silicon-28 excesses of our X grains are caused by incorporating material from this inner silicon-sulfur zone. We also say that X grains show a wide range of silicon isotopic ratios, and most of the grains are clustered around a tight correlation. And this is in fact caused by mixing material from this inner silicon-sulfur zone with materials from this outer helium-carbon zone. This mixing is necessary because silicon carbide needs to condense in a carbon-rich environment, while the helium-carbon zone is the only carbon-rich region across a type 2 supernova. And in this outer zone, silicon-28 is converted to silicon-29 and 30 by capturing neutrons. As a result, mixing drives the composition of X grains toward less negative values. In the meanwhile, so this neutron capture process also makes titanium-49 in this outer region. So now if we just examine this cartoon, we see titanium-49 in X grains could have two sources: the decay product of vanadium-49 from the inner silicon sulfur zone and titanium-49 made in this outer region helium-carbon zone, because we know X grains source the material from these two regions based on their silicon isotopic compositions. So there's a possibility that we can use this vanadium-49 to titanium-49 decay system to date the X grain formation. But before that, we need to figure out the origin of titanium-49 in X grains. I mean, the relative contributions of these two zones to the budget of titanium-49 in X grains. So now we plot the X grain data as delta titanium-49 versus delta silicon-30. So 0 is the solar system value. And we see X grains indeed exhibit large titanium-49 excesses as we expected. Also, interestingly, we see a negative correlation in this plot. And this correlation links titanium-49 to the denominator silicon isotope, silicon-28. What it means is that the silicon sulfur zone must be the dominant contributor to the titanium-49 excesses in X grains. So we see a positive correlation between titanium-49 and the silicon-28. Based on this correlation, it's clear that we can use this chronometer to date X grain formation. However, we still have a small contribution from this outer helium-carbon zone, which needs to be corrected for in order to do the dating in an accurate way. And because of this small contribution, it could be causing these scatters in this negative correlation as we observed here. So for the correction, we can use titanium-50 because titanium-50 is only made in this outer zone. The inner silicon sulfur zone is free of titanium-50. What this means is that all titanium-50 count collected in X grain is from this outer zone. If we can figure out the neutron capture production ratio of titanium-49 to titanium-50, then we can simply use titanium-50 to subtract the contribution of this outer helium-carbon zone. What is even better here is that this production ratio can be inferred from the titanium isotopic compositions of these three ungrouped supernova grains with positive silicon isotopic ratios. So these three grains have positive silicon isotopic ratios because they sampled more material from this outer helium carbon zone, so that they are enriched in the minor isotopes of silicon. And on the three ungrouped supernova grains with positive silicon isotope ratios in the literature consistently point to a production ratio of unity in their parent supernovae. So this makes our life much easier. We can simply subtract titanium-50 from titanium-49 count collected in X grain. Then the remaining titanium-49 count of a grain represents the amount of titanium-49 from this inner silicon sulfur zone due to vanadium-49 decay. And here is the same plot after subtraction. And then the corrected grain data define a tighter correlation compared to the previous plot. And this demonstrates the robustness of this method. And then the silicon sulfur zone is made of pure silicon-28, and this corresponds to minus 1,000 per mil for the delta silicon-30 notation. By extrapolating this correlation to minus 1,000 per mil, then the intercept here represents the delta titanium-39 in the silicon sulfur zone at the time of grain condensation. And also this correlation is supported by the titanium isotopic data for a 30 micron sized X grains. And typically X grains are only some micron to micrometer in size, but this X grains is huge. It's 30 micron across, and it's an aggregate of smaller micron sized dust grains. And we see the data point falls right on this correlation. So finally, we can compare the extracted value in the previous slide to model predictions for the silicon sulfur zone in supernovae of different masses. We can see the predictions are not sensitive to the progenitor mass, and in other words, the explosion energy. So this makes our result even more reliable. And the delta titanium-39 value in the silicon sulfur zone increases over time because of vanadium-39 decay. And the comparison here clearly indicates that X grains condensed at least 2 years after the explosions of their parent supernovae. So the supernova, it means the supernova ejecta needs some time to cool off in order for solid dust grains to condense. And our inferred late formation of silicon carbide grains after the explosion is consistent with the ALMA observation of dust formation around the supernova 1987A. And according to this predicted dust formation curve, 90% of the dust would form between 10 to 40 years after the explosion of supernova 1987A. And this is consistent with our results at least after 2 years after the explosion. And finally, in the last part of this lecture, we will have a look at several types of pre-solid silicon carbide grains that are characterized by large carbon-13 excesses. So these carbon-13 rich grains include the so-called nova grains and also AB grains. They typically have carbon 12 to 13 ratios lying below 10, while the solar system carbon isotopic ratio is 89. So these grains are extremely enriched in carbon-13. And the nova grains were initially thought to have come from novae, but several recent studies have suggested that they could also have been sourced from subspecial type 2 supernovae. And if you're interested in knowing the details, you can check out the papers of Pignatari et al. 2015 and Liu et al. 2016. In the next few slides, we will focus on the isotopic signatures of AB grains and see where they could have come from. So for mainstream Y and Z grains, we have the isotopic S-process isotopic signatures to link these grains to their parent AJB stars because it's so diagnostic. And for X grains, we have titanium-34, aluminum-26, silicon-28 excesses to link X grains to their parent type 2 supernovae. However, these AB grains do not have any unique isotopic signatures, and it is very challenging to link AB grains to their parent stars because we don't have any smoking guns. So what should we do to find out their parent stars? What we can do is to collect multi-element isotopic data in these grains. And linking AB grains to their parent stars is pretty much like you came across a giant crime scene with very little evidence. What you can do is to work your hardest to take what little evidence there was and try to piece it together somehow. So for two different types of stars, although they could exhibit similar isotopic signatures for some of the elements, they may exhibit different isotopic signatures for other elements. And this is the kind of evidence we're looking for by doing multi-element isotopic studies. So indeed, our recent systematic multi-element isotopic studies of AB grains have shown that AB grains with higher nitrogen-15 enrichments also show higher aluminum-26 excesses and also smaller silicon-30 excesses. And altogether, they pointed to stronger hydrogen burning processes at enhanced stellar temperatures compared to nitrogen-14 rich AB grains. And based on these observations, we divided AB grains into nitrogen-14 and nitrogen-15 rich AB grains, and by using the solar nitrogen isotopic ratio as the divider. Then in the follow-up heavy element isotopic study, we further observed that nitrogen-14 rich AB grains do not show any significant S-process isotopic enrichments as shown by these orange circles. And for comparison, mainstream grains show more negative molybdenum isotope ratios because these ratios are normalized to molybdenum 96, which is a pure S-process isotope and is abundantly made by the S-process. And this observation links nitrogen-14 rich AB grains to J-type carbon stars because we also observe that J-type carbon stars show large carbon-13 enrichments, but no S-process enrichments. So nitrogen-14 rich AB grains and the J-type carbon stars share similar chemical and isotopic compositions. In comparison, nitrogen-15 rich AB grains exhibits larger S-process enrichments than nitrogen-14 rich AB grains. And given their large carbon-13, nitrogen-15, aluminum-26, and S-process enrichments, we proposed that these grains could also be type 2 supernova duster grains in this paper. And our proposal in the 2018 abstract paper is also supported by spectroscopic observations of carbon stars because we see there's no carbon star lying in the region where nitrogen-15 rich AB grains are located. And therefore, this suggests that nitrogen-15 rich AB grains are likely to have been sourced from explosive events like the ejecta of type 2 supernovae. Overall, the takeaway here is that we have stardust grains from all types of carbon stars and other unknown stellar sources. And by studying their isotopic compositions and populations, it will help us better understand their parent stars like the mysterious stellar objects, J-type carbon stars. So far, we do not know the stellar evolution path of J-type carbon stars, and clearly, the study of nitrogen-14 rich AB grains can provide more clues to solving this puzzle. So in conclusion, stardust grains are awesome. We have stardust samples from all types of carbon stars and also from type 2 supernovae and also novae. We can study these bona fide stellar materials within the full battery of modern microanalytical techniques to extract their chemical isotopic and structural information down to atomic scale. In particular, the combination of SIMS and RIMS instruments allow us to examine the isotopic compositions of almost all the elements in a periodic table in a single micron-sized pre-solar dust grain. And in this talk, I showed you how to use this isotopic data to constrain the stellar model calculations and also to constrain dust formation in stellar environments. Also, I showed you the power of doing multi-element isotopic analysis when we don't have smoking guns to pin down the stellar origins of some of the grains. The systematic investigation of these mysterious carbon-13 rich grains will definitely lead to a better understanding of the mysterious stellar evolutions of J-type carbon stars and also as C-type carbon stars. And this is all I have for you today. Thanks for your attention, and I'll see you next Tuesday.